Welcome to the first episode of The Arbitral Voice, a new videocast series created by Young ITA. My name is Shai Lachter, and it is my pleasure to welcome today Toby Landau Casey. Toby is a barrister, advocate, and arbitrator. He is a member of the bars of England and Wales, Northern Ireland, Singapore, the BVI, and New York. Toby, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great pleasure.
You are based in Singapore, but you are currently in Washington, D.C., just on time for the cherry blossom. How do you like D.C. so far?
I like it very much, except for the rain and the grey and the lack of sun.
I'm sure it reminds you of London a bit.
It does, actually, very, very similar. Yes.
I'm sorry for the weather. You were here yesterday for the event dedicated to the legacy of Johnny Wieder, who I understand was your mentor. And since this videocast was created within the ITA mentorship program, I'm keen to have your insight on the value of mentorship. What are your thoughts?
Actually, I think mentorship is one of the most critical features of growing up as a practitioner. If I think now, with the amazing privilege I had of Johnny Vida as a mentor, even now, having done this job for about 30 years, I still think through Johnny's eyes when I face any particular issue. And that's the strength of good mentorship. And Johnny always used to say that you can tell practitioners who have been well mentored and those who haven't.
Yeah, that's so nice to hear. And so now you have practiced for 30 years, but I'm curious, and our audience is probably curious. Can you tell us about your first appointment?
Yeah, I mean, the first appointment was absolutely terrifying. And it came about by being in the right place at the right time, as often these things happen. Mm. So to get appointed, you've got to be on somebody's radar. Yes. Either it's an institution that's choosing you, or it's parties. And in my case, I got chosen because I was on people's radar for a different reason. Not for sitting, but for having worked on the English Arbitration Act, which was in 1996. I did that at the beginning of my career at the English Bar. And because people were very generous in and around that project to give me credit for the work I did, I became quite well known, and people naturally, mistakenly assumed that I was a seasoned arbitrator, which I wasn't. So my first appointment was well beyond my experience and comfort zone. Rather than doing a small case as a sole arbitrator, I suddenly found myself as president of a tribunal with some very senior co-arbitrators, very senior counsel on each side, in a complex reinsurance case.
And how did you manage this case?
It was a white knuckle ride. It was terrifying, but I lent heavily on my co-arbitrators, and I have to say I lent heavily on my mentor. Yeah. So behind the scenes, Johnny was there guiding me through it.
And speaking about the beginning of the career and first appointments, it is usually said that one is learning from his mistakes. So I'm wondering whether you did a mistake in the beginning of your career from which you learned the most.
So do you mean mistake as arbitrator or as counsel?
Both.
Or both.
Yes.
And so I have a long list of mistakes, and you've assumed that they were early in my career, but mistakes carry on throughout one's career, and it's a learning exercise as one goes along. But I think, I suppose one of the early mistakes, which I think is useful for people to hear about, is as counsel to walk through an arbitration process without really strategizing and thinking about what each individual case actually needs and how best to position yourself. And by that I can think of early cases where I went through the steps as counsel that one would ordinarily expect of an arbitration, and in retrospect thinking that wasn't the best way to present the case. But you're told that you do various things. You line up all the witnesses, and you cross-examine all the other side's witnesses, and you tickle every argument that's available, and you do everything that you try to do to be able to present a sort of complete picture. And in retrospect, you think actually you've done about twice as much as you should have done, and you haven't actually selected. And that, I have memories now of sitting there in an arbitration wondering why I'm cross-examining a witness. Because actually, in the end, I'm not getting anything out of it. I'm giving a platform to the witness. And if you don't think strategically, then naturally you think, well, I'll cross-examine all the witnesses. And I learned so much early on from realizing you should never do that. A lot of it is strategy. A lot of it is about seeing the case through the eyes of the tribunal and being selective and doing less than you're taught.
And conversely, do you have a moment that you're extremely proud of in your career, whether as counsel or arbitrator?
So I have some moments where I've felt proud about something, and I think what sticks in my mind are the instances when I have argued a case before an apex court in an arbitration matter, and where I feel that I have contributed to making law. That sounds really pompous, but they're real moments, especially the UK Supreme Court. So I've done a number of Supreme Court cases where I have sweated blood beforehand, trying to get ready for it, being very nervous about it, formulating something. And when you get to an apex court, different from a lower court, you can actually put forward policy-based arguments. You're not constrained in the common law system by precedent in the same way as you would be in a lower court. And the moment of pride comes when you read a judgment and something you thought of has been adopted, and that becomes law. And that is something very, very special when you actually feel you've made a contribution, where your way of conceptualizing something has actually been found credible.
And do you have an example as an arbitrator of your proudest moment?
Proudest moment is probably, well, I suppose they're small moments of pride in an arbitration for me, and that is when you have sometimes a temporary breakout of peace between the parties. So if you walk into a situation which is fractious, which is highly confrontational, I think it's a moment of pride where you've managed the process such that actually everybody's agreeing. And that happens incrementally. It happens in steps during an exercise, during an arbitration, rather than people just being locked in combat. If the process is eased by moments of consensus, and that's something that you've created as an arbitrator, then overall you're heading towards an end result that people will be happy with, and they'll buy into it.
Do you feel that this is one of the roles of the arbitrator, to create a facilitation process for the parties?
Yes, I don't mean by that for settlement,
of course,
but I mean for sure. And that's also have to go back to my mentor. That was one of Johnny Vida's great skills. However much people hated each other at the beginning, if they had been in a process before Johnny, they would end up liking each other, liking him, liking themselves, and liking each other. It was incredible, the influence he had, and that's something that I aspire to, and I think it is part of the role, because it's a way of actually getting to a compelling, legitimate, robust answer, and it's so much harder to do that if you are in the midst of warfare, and increasingly nowadays it is warfare. So that's the moment of happiness and pride as an arbitrator, where you feel that you've quelled the passions and people are buying into the process.
Thank you very much for sharing some thoughts about your career. And with your permission, we will now move on to some substantial arbitration questions regarding damages in arbitration. The field of damages in ISDS have changed for the last 20 years. And nowadays we hear more and more critiques of the amount of compensation awarded to investors. Do you have any thoughts about the valuation models which are currently being used in arbitration?
I do. I think it's worth just pausing on the way that you put the question, because it's right that the field of damages has changed over, say, 20 years. But one has to ask why that is. And I think part of it is that the nature of the cases have changed. Cases have, in a sense, become more complex. They've become larger. And I think that's because the field of ISDS has grown in its scope. There are kinds of cases now that are within its ambit that may not have been 20 years ago. When you look at things like creeping expropriation, indirect expropriation, for example, or the definition of investment, we are in a different territory to where we were 20 years ago. And what that means is that as the coverage extends, so modeling becomes more complicated and it becomes more sophisticated in order to quantify loss in areas that, when you were talking about 20 years ago, a good old-fashioned expropriation of a construction site or something like that, it wasn't as complicated. So I think that's really the starting point. It's not just that the focus on damages has changed, it's the actual reason why we are in this field and sort of computations that we're faced with. Having said that, in my experience over, say, 20 to 30 years, there is now much more complexity that tribunals are faced with when they get to quantification of damages. And that, I think, is a function of a growing expert bar, that is, professional experts who themselves are growing in their experience. And actually now, as a tribunal member, one can be faced with very complex modelling in order to work out damages, way, way beyond the ability of many arbitrators.
And this brings me to my next question. How financially literate should an arbitrator be?
So they should be entirely literate if they're going to decide upon a dispute which involves determinations involving modelling. And I'm afraid, generally, with some notable exceptions, they're not. There's nothing in our field to say that arbitrators have to be qualified in economics, in financial modelling, in damages generally, or they have to be experienced. And arbitrators are not generally chosen with that quality in mind. I think our focus has always been on issues of liability, issues of jurisdiction. And when it comes to quantum, that's left till last. It's not driving choices of arbitrators. And the result is, very often you will have a tribunal that actually is skimming on the surface when it comes to quantum.
Do you have a proposal how to address this issue?
I mean, part of it may be training for arbitrators, actually, which is not so readily available. But arbitrators really should have crash courses on economics relevant to the particular case that they're sitting on. I think that would be welcome. And I think if you were to ask arbitrators, even the great and the good, whether they would benefit from that, they would say yes. It's an area which people venture upon with some trepidation, actually, but they won't admit it because they don't want to shake people's confidence in the process. So what actually happens in many cases, not naming any names, tempting though it is, you get arbitrators who will keep a straight face during the quantum exercise, and they will nod as if they're taking it all in. And they will be faced with complex presentations and complex expert reports and complex cross-examination as counsel get more sophisticated in this area. And when that tribunal then retires to deliberate, the level of debate is shockingly superficial.
And speaking precisely about expert reports, do you feel that there is a way in which they should be changed when they are presented to tribunals?
So one of the problems with many expert reports is that the audience is mistakenly thought to be the other side's expert, so that there can be quite a high level of debate, complex debate between experts on complex concepts, forgetting that the tribunal may be in between and lost. So actually, quite often it's quite a task to wade through expert reports. We now have usually or commonly a process of experts giving presentations, which are very, very helpful, and tribunals value them greatly. But sometimes there's only half an hour, 45 minutes, instead of a direct examination. Actually, I think what is more needed is a dumbing down for tribunals, so that although the concepts are complex and they have to be complex and they have to be dealt with at that level, tribunals need to be educated. And what I have seen done, which can be really helpful, is actually a teach-in, which can be done by both experts for the tribunal, which can be done neutrally. That is, a teach-in on the concepts before those concepts are applied to the facts of the case.
And do you feel that the cross-examination of experts during hearings is beneficial to the tribunal?
Sometimes. When I wear my hat as counsel, I think cross-examination is very, very important. Because especially now that we have a full-time professional expert bar, which is an odd concept. So these are experts who are, I would say, hired guns, but they are generally hired guns. That is, they are paid to put forward a particular view, and they're willing to do so. And that therefore puts a burden on counsel to unpack the expert report, and that becomes very important because experts are working for one side. And they're putting forward a view which is not necessarily biased, but it's leaning in one direction. So cross-examination is very important in that way. But I also think that cross-examination makes life sometimes more difficult for tribunals, because what they have will be two sets of questions and answers, which they then have to make sense of at the end of the day when they're deliberating. And what can be much, much easier and much more efficient is actually hot tubbing, is actually having experts together and the tribunal having the opportunity to really question one and then the other, and not have the filter of a cross-examining counsel in between, where the questions are all directed in one way and they're not open questions.
And do you feel that a tribunal appointed expert might be the solution?
It can be, but there are problems with that. Sometimes you just add further layers of procedural complexity, because the parties will want to examine the tribunal's expert, or there won't be agreement on a particular expert, or the tribunal ends up with 3 views rather than 2 views, and that can be even more complicated. But there are other permutations which I've seen and which actually can work very well. So I just give you one example, and that is I've seen in practice the process whereby you start with a party-appointed expert on each side. They will present the case, they'll be cross-examined, and then there'll come a moment where each of those experts changes their role and becomes a tribunal expert. And that requires all parties to consent to that. And the grip of instructing counsel is let go at that point. And those experts who know the case very well then start to assist the tribunal. Now, again, it's frightening for counsel because you lose control. But as a sort of genuine exercise to allow the tribunal to understand the issues and test their understanding, it can be very, very effective.
And given the complexities of quantum in today's arbitration world, do you feel that a bifurcation of the quantum phase from the beginning of the case will assist in rendering the procedure more efficient?
I don't think there's an absolute answer to that. Cases come in all shapes and sizes, and there are many reasons in particular cases why bifurcation is inefficient. But it does for sure help a tribunal to know what the factual position is before you start testing some model, rather than testing a model against a whole different range of factual variables. Modeling is complex itself, increasingly complex, and if the inputs haven't yet been determined, then the whole exercise is made that much harder, of course.
Okay. And for our last question, do you have anything in the field of damages which you would like to preserve, or conversely, which you would like to improve for the sake of the efficiency of the proceeding?
I think there's so much that needs to be improved on this. I think it's a inadequate part of our exercise, and it's a vital part. I mean, even again, wearing my hat as counsel, I tend to see cases very much in terms of liability issues and jurisdiction issues, and then you come to quantum afterwards, and that's just the tendency, because we're trained in law, we're not trained in economics, and the economics part is something which some people feel very engaged with, and others feel that just comes along with everything else. And that's to be juxtaposed with the fact that we are dealing with massive amounts of money in many of these cases, and that our damages awards can have incredible consequences in the field of ISDS states. We can be rendering awards that will equate to significant portions of a state's budget. And if that's going to be a massive allocation of public resources, then we have a duty to pay proper focus to it. That at the moment is just not happening. And I think that there are many awards which one could criticize because the analysis on damages is inadequate. And again, I'm not really blaming tribunals, because I think that these are difficult areas. So I think there's a lot that needs to be rethought here in terms of training, in terms of the way in which damages issues are presented, and the way in which they are deliberated upon. Each of those segments needs to be rethought, actually.
And this concludes the first episode of Arbitral Voices. Thank you very much, Toby, for this fruitful discussion, which I enjoyed, and I'm sure our audience enjoyed as well.
Great pleasure.
Stay tuned for the next episode, and see you next time.